Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for showing up for our discussion of running VMs as native virtual disks in Windows 10. Before I get started on the presentation, I'm just going to do a little housekeeping stuff with you. We will be talking, or you'll be listening to me for about 30-35 minutes, and then after that we'll go to Q&A. I was wrong before. There will be a mic in the room, so if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. I'll recognize you, and Simone will bring you the microphone, and you can ask your question. That way we can get the question on tape. If you don't want to wait, that's okay too. I'll just repeat your question then before we put it up for an answer so that we can get it on tape. And I'm really into learning from the audience as well as sharing what I know. So the Q&A sessions are usually the best part of the whole shooting match. So now that it's 10:45 and the door is closed, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ed Tittle. I'm a longtime Austinite. I've lived in the area since 1976 when I came here to go to grad school at UT. Never got away. So it's always fun for me to come to Spice World because I get to do it from my own backyard. I'm a Windows Insider MVP. I've been one for the last couple of years, and I have a website called win10.guru that if you're not familiar with and you work with Windows 10, you might find some interesting content on there. One of the things that I just learned this morning was that SpiceWorks is not going to make the slides available to you guys. They will make a video recording of this session available, but as you'll see in my presentation, it's full of hyperlinks. And there's a lot of stuff in there I'm pretty sure you're going to want to be able to get access to. So I'm going to go ahead and post the PowerPoint for this presentation on my website, which is edtittle.com. And there's a story at win10.guru that this presentation is based on, and I'll put a link to the slides at the end of that story as well. So you have two different places that you can go. At the end of the presentation, I'll have some discussion of that to remind you about that, but you can get your hands on this stuff. I'll put it up this afternoon when I get home, so you should be able to get to it either later this evening or first thing tomorrow morning. A little bit about win10.guru. We started the website, Kari the Finn and I, that's his picture over there on the other side of the slide, a couple of years ago. We actually got started in about June of 2017, and we waited until we had enough articles up there to make it worth visiting, and so we launched it on the first of last year. And our goal was to provide information about Windows 10 for professionals. Kari's a former Windows 10 MVP, and he's got a lot of experience, including working as a consultant for IBM. He specializes in deployment. He knows more about sysprep than anybody else I know, and I've learned an awful lot from him. And if you check out some of our articles on win10.guru, you might learn a little bit too. Here's a picture of Kari's boot menu. Kari's a little bit of a Renaissance man. He's from Finland. And I don't know how much you guys know about Finland, but people in Finland always learn to speak Swedish because it used to be part of Sweden at one point. He also speaks German and English and French. And so his boot menu has the British version of English on it for Windows 10. It has the Finnish version, and it has the Swedish version on it, and then it has a couple of recovery tools on it. And most of the OS items that you see in there are actually VHDs, as is shown on the slide. And the interesting thing that I've been learning recently, and that not a lot of people know, is that if you create a virtual hard disk image correctly inside a Hyper-V, you can actually install it on the boot menu and boot it right from the boot menu. So it doesn't really run as a virtual machine. It runs as a Windows image as a host OS. So you get all the advantages of running directly on the hardware. Very slick. So we call this a native boot virtual hard disk, and because I don't want to say that a lot, I have created the acronym NBVHD, which may or may not be an improvement. This could be either a VHD or a VHDX file. A little bit later on, I'll explain to you why it's easier to use a VHD than a VHDX. But as we all know, VHD is one of the file formats that Hyper-V uses for running virtual machines. And when I say that it's a native boot type of environment, it means you can actually install it in the boot menu and boot into it from the boot menu in Windows 10. So we'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of these things. You can run it from a single file, the VHD itself. It runs as a boot image. It's faster than a VM because you're not running inside a host OS and having to relay everything from the virtual machine through the host OS to get to the hardware. You're going straight to the hardware. And of course, that means there's no emulation involved. So that really explains in a nutshell why it's so much faster. Now, why wouldn't you want to use a VM as your boot image? Well, there's one big major problem with using a VM as a boot image, and that is you can run Windows Update against that image and it'll work okay, but when it comes time to upgrade, it'll puke. It just won't work. You get an error message and it won't complete. It'll tell you you cannot upgrade a virtual machine. So the trick to doing that, I'll explain in more detail a bit later, is just to run it as a VM instead of booting to it, and then you can upgrade it and then revert back to the other. But you do have to create a new boot menu entry because the GUID changes that it uses to drive the boot menu. So you actually have to rebuild the boot menu to do that. So it's a pretty simple process to deploy Windows 10 to a VHD. We've created a Diskpart script, and this is another thing I learned from Kari. I didn't even know you could run scripts against Diskpart, but it turns out if you put a /s for script switch on the command, you can then point it at a script and it'll go ahead and run it automatically instead of making you type in the commands one at a time. Then we've got a batch file that runs that script that uses DISM to deploy Windows into the disk setup that you've just created, and it creates a new boot menu entry for you automatically so that you'll see the newly added boot image when the next time you go into the boot menu. There's another little gotcha about that in terms of defaults, but we'll go over that shortly. The article that all of this was originally introduced in comes from win10.guru, and the title of that article shows up at the bottom of the slide. It's true, it makes dual boot very easy, but I think it's good for a lot of other stuff than that. Me personally, as a Windows insider, I run most of the insider images, the fast ring, the slow ring, and the release preview. And what this technique lets me do is it lets me run a production version of Windows 10, 1903 right now, as my base OS for that machine, but then I can install all these other items in the boot menu, and I can run the insider images anytime I want to as a native image. And for testing stuff especially related to hardware or device drivers and that kind of stuff, it's a lot more effective than working through a typical normal virtual machine running inside a hypervisor. Here is what the Diskpart script looks like. First thing we're doing is creating the disk and giving it a file name and a layout and a size. We create ours usually as an expandable type, which means they've got a maximum extent and they start out being only as big as they need to do. Then we attach to that virtual disk, we label it as a primary partition, which those of you that know about this stuff means we're using the master boot record approach, the type 1 hypervisor approach, and creating a VHD file, give it a label, assign a driver letter to it, and then the script is done. A lot of people are concerned that I'm not recommending UEFI and using GPT formatting with this. And the reason why I'm not recommending that is primarily because it's more complicated to set it up. If anybody really wants to know how to do it with a VHDX and a GPT, we figured it out, and I can provide that information to you if you want to email me. I'll send you the details. There really aren't any benefits to setting this up as a GPT unless you need more than 2 terabytes. And in most cases, you really don't, because you're just running an OS and testing stuff. And basically, the way the script works is we're setting up a 50 gig VHD. We're putting it in a location on the F drive, assigning it a temporary letter. And when you run the script, you usually run it from a file name inside your user directory. And we can also, you can just cut and paste this information from the slides or from the story up on win10.guru and create the script file in about 10 seconds. It's the batch file that runs the Diskpart script and the other stuff that really does the heavy lifting to create this environment for you. The interesting thing is, if you look at the bottom of the slide, that's the output from command.exe that shows what the script looks like when it's running. It's really doing quite a bit, but it doesn't really tell you a whole lot. So you just know that it's kind of working. But the way that it works is we run the Diskpart script to set up our disk layout for the virtual disk. Then we use DISM to go ahead and read an image file. In this case, we're reading a Windows 10 image from the J drive in the sources directory, and we're going to go ahead and apply that to the virtual disk space that we've set up, and that's where we're getting our OS from. So whatever you point at there in terms of the target for the image file parameter on the DISM command, that's actually going to define what OS you're installing into that virtual machine. So that's kind of an important thing. You know, you want to make sure you grab the right one and the right language and the right number of bits and all that kind of stuff. And then we run BCD boot to set it up as a bootable image, and then we run BCD edit to associate the boot menu entry that's going to show up on your boot menu when you start up the machine, so that you know what you're looking at. And that's basically all there is to it. It's a pretty simple process. Depending on how fast your hardware is, it'll take anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes to complete. And it's going to depend on how big the image file is that you're working with and how fast your disk drive's working, yada, yada, yada. You guys know the story. So it's the /s in line 1 that tells Diskpart to run the script, and we target the script in the later part of that command statement. We're getting our Windows 10 image from a mounted ISO on the J drive in this particular example that you saw on the preceding slide. The apply drive letter that you use in the discussion is the one that was specified in the Diskpart script, so you're all pointing at the same disk structure. The BCD boot command defines the boot structure for the W drive. Now, the reason why we set this up as a W drive in our approach, and you guys might do things differently, is that generally we tend to reserve the letters from T on through the end of the alphabet for drives that we want to create and manage ourselves, because that way Windows can manage the top part of the alphabet as you plug in and unplug devices and blah, blah, blah. And we're going to manage the stuff at the end of the alphabet so that we don't end up creating dual drive letters, which can cause some interesting troubles from time to time if you ever get stuck in that. BCD edit command, again, is what adds the entry that shows up on the boot menu, and the rest of the text in that batch file just outputs that status message that we saw and ends the batch program. So the reason why native boot VHDs I think are interesting is because they're fast, easy, and simple to use. When you deploy one of these things, the native boot VHD appears in the boot menu as the default OS. And that's just the way that Windows works. Whenever I install a new OS onto a machine, it assumes that I want this new installation to be my default. In most cases, that's not really what we want. So you're going to have to change the default after you're finished with the process. And the process for getting it up and running has to be completed, though, before you can start messing around with the boot menu. And of course, I hope it's obvious to all of you that you need to run the batch file at an elevated privilege level, because you're doing OS installation, and that means administrative PowerShell or run as administrator for command.exe. So you're going to boot to the native boot VHD and restart the PC, when the boot menu shows up, that native boot VHD is going to show up as the default. And when you get to the out-of-box experience part of the installation process, it's going to go through multiple restarts. So don't reset the default OS in the boot menu until the whole process is finished. And in fact, if you want to, we'll talk about this a little bit later, you can allow the default to boot and then apply customizations to that image so that you can add applications or maybe change preferences or appearance stuff. And then you'll reset the default when the whole process is finished. And just in case you don't remember, there's 3 different ways that you can reset the boot default in Windows 10. I usually opt for the third one, which is to go to the System Properties Advanced tab. You can then go into the boot setup and choose your default boot right from a list of stuff there. But you can also use the change default option that shows up in the boot menu itself, which lets you do that. And if you're a real command line junkie, you can use the BCD edit command to change the identifier that's associated with the default OS at the command line. And I just put a little bit of BCD edit text there on the slide so you could see that the identifier that we're talking about appears in the first line in the output for the various attributes of the boot objects. Excuse me. So what kind of customizations can we do with a native boot VHD? You can go ahead and run customization before the restart if you want to use sysprep. And I include an article at the end of the story that explains how to use Control Shift F3 to get into the audit mode while you're doing install and then run sysprep from there. So basically what you'll do is you'll create a file named unattend.xml, and that's where you'll do all your customizations. You need to put it in a Panther folder underneath the Windows root directory for the OS and copy your unattend.xml to the Panther folder, and then when out-of-box experience runs, Windows Setup will apply whatever you've defined in your sysprep stuff automatically. And there's a detailed example of a pretty elaborate unattend.xml file in the story up on win10.guru, but I didn't really think we had time to go through that this morning, so I'm not going to deal with that right now. But I also include an MS Docs article pointer at the end of the presentation that talks about the whole sysprep OOBE and how to boot into that environment and manipulate it. And I think it's really something worth learning how to do if you haven't messed with it before. Only thing is, it's kind of a rat hole. So if you're going to do it on a weekend or a day when you're not real busy, because once you get started, it's going to take you at least a couple, 3 hours to get back out and start breathing fresh air. So I want to go back to the disadvantage of using this technique, and that is that you cannot use setup.exe to upgrade a native boot VHD. And you see the error message. I don't know if you can really see that or not. Up there in the upper right on the slide, but it says this PC can't run Windows 10, which of course we know is a lie. But if you look at the error message, it says you can't upgrade Windows on a virtual drive, and that's really the crux of the matter. So how do we work around this? You know, it being Windows and us being IT guys, if you can't do it through the front door, you know there's always a way to do it through the back door. So the way to do it through the back door is to take the NB VHD image offline and just operate it on it like an image. You can use DISM then to apply the upgrade image to that virtual machine image while it's not running. You can use DISM then to redeploy the image to a new upgraded native boot VHD. Remember, I said before we have to create a new boot entry because the GUID changes. When we upgrade the OS, the global unique identifier that's associated with the OS changes. So we can't use the old boot menu entry anymore, even though it's more or less the same thing, just upgraded. We have to create a new one because it's got a new GUID. So we'll delete the old boot menu entry, add a new boot menu entry, and then we're back. You know, you're ready to run it from the boot menu again. what about other virtualization platforms? This is something that Kari and I started talking about 10 days ago, and I said, hey, you know, you can convert VMDKs to VDMs or to other formats. You can convert the VDI format from Oracle's VirtualBox into a VDM. So I mean VHD. Why not use that to bring other virtualization platforms in for boot the same way? So because we know that we can convert VMDK files to VHD and we can convert VDI files to VHD, theoretically this means you could use them for a boot. But neither Kari nor I are actually running either one of those environments, so we didn't actually get to try it. So I think it might work, but I'm hoping that some of you guys that are actually using VMware or VirtualBox might try it and shoot me an email and let me know if it works or not. Because I think it's pretty interesting that you'd be able to boot a different virtual machine inside of Windows 10, and I'm kind of curious to see if it's actually going to fly or not. So my email address is down there, and I definitely want to hear from you if you give it a try. I won't be surprised if it doesn't work, but I'll be pleased if it does work, and I hope that somebody can help me figure that out. So here's the additional reading and resources that I was talking about. That there's a lot of useful stuff here. There's a tutorial on 7 forums, and we were talking about Windows 7 earlier, that shows how to do this in the Windows environment. There's the article that this story is based on. There's another story that actually goes step by step through the details on how to upgrade the native boot VHD if you decide you want to do that. So it'll take you through it step by step. Kari's created a video version of this that's available at 10 forums. And there's also a really terrific story that we put together about working with sysprep answer files if you want to learn a little bit more about that kind of stuff. I also turned to some third-party materials that I thought you guys might find interesting in this context. One of them explains how to boot to audit mode to run sysprep during installation. It comes from MS-DOCS. If you're working with systems that you want to turn into VHDs, Mark Rusinovich and his folks at SysInternals, which is now part of Microsoft, and he, of course, I think he's the CTO for the Azure group at Microsoft right now, they created this utility called Disk to VHD, where you can actually take a running OS and convert it to a VHD, and I find that really handy for all kinds of purposes. I found an article, a blog post actually, in MS-DOCS that talks about how to convert a VHD to a VHDX if you want to do it in PowerShell. I found a Meta IOP article that talks about how to convert VirtualBox VDI files to VHD files. And then I found an MSDN blog that talks about how to convert a VMware VMDK to a Hyper-V VHD. And that, all that stuff you guys, I think, are going to find interesting in terms of working with this particular setup and technique. One of the things I'd like to emphasize upon closing is that you can run virtual machines in the Windows 10 environment using a VHDX file. But that's a type 2. When you create it in Hyper-V, you have to create it as a type 2 hypervisor VHD. And unlike a VHD file, it actually requires the whole disk layout to be created that you see when you use disk management to look at a boot drive in Windows 10. You see there's a recovery partition, there's a 16 megabyte Microsoft Reserve partition, there's an EFI partition, and then there's an OS partition at a minimum. And you actually have to create that structure on the disk layout when you're running the Diskpart script in order to do that. So it ends up being more work. And I'm one of those kind of guys where if there's 2 ways to do things, and one of them's less work than the other, I don't usually pay much attention to the one that's more work unless I have a compelling reason to do so. And so far I haven't found a compelling reason to do that. But we have adapted the Diskpart script that I showed you here in the presentation to also work with a VHDX approach. So if you guys download the materials, I'll make sure to include that information in what you'll be downloading, so that if you want to go the other way and do the more work, be my guest. That's just not the way. The whole reason I'm doing this is because it's quick and easy, and a lot of times it's a throwaway sort of situation where I'm just trying something out and I don't really even want to keep it around. One of the really cool things I didn't mention about the advantage of this technique is that when you don't want to use that virtual disk anymore, you can just remove it from the boot menu and it's gone. That's it. Of course, you do have to clean up the files and stuff, but I mean, that's all there is to it. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to use it anymore when you decide you don't want to use it. So now we have concluded my portion of the presentation, and we'll start handling questions. So Simone, are you in here? Yeah, there she is. She's got the microphone. You want to raise your hand? Simone will bring you the microphone, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
So can everybody hear me? So when you run it this way, the one thing that I have issues with is when I run VMs, I'm limited to it's not using any of the hardware that's built in the machine. So when I do it this way, I can run the graphics adapters. Everything will show locally in that VHD or the virtual machine.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah. You're not emulating anymore. You're actually making direct use of hardware.
Perfect.
It's like a real boot image in that sense. So,
okay.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question.
Thank you.
I know we have a question over there. He wanted to ask about something. No, you changed your mind? Okay, all right. Please.
I'd just like to expand on his question. So that goes for like security dongles as well? If there's like
I don't know. I would suspect, just based on the way that it works, that the answer is yes. But the only way to figure it out for sure is to try it. And given that it only takes about 15 minutes to set this up and run it, it'd be pretty easy to do that.
Thank you.
Other questions? Here, we got one right here.
Yeah, so expanding on what these two are talking about, I'm looking at this where I see the real advantage is it's a better test environment.
Yes.
Because I use virtual machines to test software all the time.
Right.
So I don't blow up my local machine or whatever. But this is, you're testing your hardware and everything. That sounds pretty interesting.
Right. Yeah. And if you're involved with the Insider program and you're working, they typically release about on a weekly schedule, at least in the fast ring, and you've got images coming and going all the time. If you're limited in terms of the hardware that you have available to you, you can still be testing all that stuff just by running it as one of these native boot V8. And then when you don't need to run it, you just boot to your normal OS. Kari, my partner, he's actually crazy enough that he runs his production PCs on the Insider fast ring. I don't do that. If I'm going to run an Insider release on a production machine, I'm going to run it this way. I'm not going to run it as the main OS, because too many things can go wrong, and have in my experience. So yeah, you're right, it is a great test technique, and that's primarily what I think it's best used for. The other thing is, though, you might look at it this way. If you're in an environment where you have to run Windows in multiple languages, this is a great way to go ahead and install them and then be able to switch back and forth between them very simply. And to my way of thinking, this is a much easier way to dual boot or multi-boot in the Windows 10 environment than other techniques, like if you have to bring in a third-party bootloader like Grub or something like that, or fiddle the boot menu using BCD edit and, to do it right. It's really kind of a pain in the butt. More questions? Wow, this is nowhere. Oh, good, please. I hate to let you go this quick.
I guess one more would be, how does licensing work with this?
I can't hear you.
Licensing. How does licensing work?
That's a very good question. Licensing from Microsoft is that every running OS has to have its own license. So you can do this in one of two ways, because if you're using it in a throwaway, I just recommend that you go download the evaluation. They actually have predefined VHDs that you can download from the Microsoft website. So you can, and you don't need a license for those because they're going to run out. I think they're 30 days. But if you do want to run it as a like in Kari's case, where he's got a Finnish version, a Swedish version, and an English version, he's got a separate license for each one.
if it was my sole boot option, this is the only thing I'm booting to, would I
Right.
be okay with my OEM license?
Well, according to Kari, the activation inside each OS sees the same hardware stamp, so it somehow sees itself as
I
the
guess.
same OS. So because you can only run one of them at a time, it actually is legal to have more than one copy on the machine. If you want to use it in a production environment or a commercial environment, the safest thing would be to have a separate key for each one. But if you're in an environment where it's the only device you're using, yeah, you can switch back and forth between them.
Thank you.
Good question. Thanks. Anybody else? We got another one up here.
To answer what you're talking about there, I recently had a situation where I had a dental office. The guy was retiring, and I wanted to virtualize his 2 servers onto a laptop for him because he's got to keep his records for 7 years. And I found out through Microsoft that if I got enterprise, I could run all of those legally.
Sure,
on-
because
on
that's a Mac.
enterprise.
Yeah. That's a
And so I think
multiple
that would be the
activation
thing.
key,
If
right?
you were worried about that, you could do the same thing with Windows 10.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're on a multiple activation key and you haven't exceeded your maximum number of instances, then you're golden anyway. So yeah, that's very true. What else we got? One over here.
To get back to licensing, let's say, I know you said you could download the one every 30 days, but sometimes when I'm just messing around with things, it might go for months. I might not get it done in 30 days. If I were to just install it strictly to mess around, test environment, test new builds, do they let you just play around with it if it's not technically a production system?
There used to be a way to request an extension on an evaluation. You could eat. I don't remember if they're still allowing that anymore. The other well-known trick in this instance is to uninstall and reinstall, and your clock starts over again. So that would, one of those techniques would surely work. The real question is the SBA going to come audit you while you're doing this or not? That would be the only circumstance under which you might get a little heartburn from it. So YMMV, as they say on the internet. Other question?
Thank
I
you.
thought we saw another one there. Okay, we're good.
I got one more.
Sure.
I'm a one-person show, so what you're talking about, I do all the time. I've got my main Windows 10 OS, and I've got what I call it my base Windows 10 virtual machine. And when I want to do something, I make a copy of it and then set it up and test. And occasionally it'll pop up and says, "This is an unlicensed version," and I said, "Go out and check yourself." And it goes out and checks and comes back and says it's registered. And so
Good to know.
I look at it from the point of view is I'm not stealing from Microsoft. I'm using this in a test environment. It's not going into production. And if they want to come investigate me, fine.
I think
it's
from a
not gonna
morality
happen.
standpoint,
Yeah.
if it's evaluation and you're really doing evaluation, then Microsoft doesn't really have much cause
Yeah.
for alarm there. How many power supplies do we have here? I'm wondering what just happened. The AV stuff, did the room lights just get turned off? We still got juice. That's weird. All right. Anybody else have any more questions? Well, hey, if you guys want to keep hanging around, we can end the video now, but if you want to keep hanging around and talking, we can do that. And thank you very much for coming. I hope you found this as interesting to hear about as I found it to play around with. Thank you.